Good day. Over the last 24 hours, the biggest event, as far as I'm concerned, is the speech that the Russian President Vladimir Putin gave to the Valdai discussion group, and that will be the main topic of my discussion over the course of this video. However, before getting to that speech and discussing what Putin said, I'm going to say, as I traditionally do, something about the military situation on the battlefields. Now, again, the overall appearance is one of stability. There's not been much movement from either side in any direction. Getting constant dribble of reports about more fighting in Bakhmut and Bakhmut city. There's sort of constant suggestions that the Wagner group and the Russian forces that are supporting the Wagner group are making ever deeper inroads into the city, that they're snipping away at the communications links in Bakhmut city. It's, however, clearly a tough grind, a difficult battle. And on that topic, I was fascinated to read a rather strange report from the British Ministry of Defence and from about heavy Russian losses, and also an article in the Daily Telegraph talking about Russia using human wave tactics in the Battle of Bakhmut. That, by the way, the last is absolutely not the case. There's no sign at all that the Wagner organization or the Russian military are engaging in human wave tactics. As I've said many times, no one, in my opinion, in this war is doing anything like that. Not the Russians, not the Ukrainians. But if we're talking about Bakhmut, it has been steady, incremental advances by the Wagner group and its supporting forces, all carried out in a very careful, systematic way, clearly with the intention of avoiding casualties. I have to say, reading that article in the Daily Telegraph, it did make me wonder whether this commentary, though based purportedly on certain things that President Zelensky of Ukraine had said, wasn't actually a piece of quiet advice being given in a public forum, supplementing what might have been private advice also being given to the Ukrainian military. I've spoken many times in many programs about my utter dismay at the profligate way in which Ukraine has conducted this war. The fact that it persists in holding on to ground for as long as it possibly can, even at the expense of massive casualties, and even when it becomes clear that that ground it's trying to cling on to is basically undefendable. And the same is true about Ukraine's habit of carrying out repeated attacks, which we've seen ever since the start of the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive at the end of August, carrying out repeated attacks against what are becoming increasingly heavily fortified Russian lines, again at the expense of enormous casualties. And I do wonder whether this article in the Daily Telegraph wasn't a quiet public rebuke, advice, if you like, to Ukraine to reconsider these tactics. As I said, if so, I'm sure that this has been said much more clearly and forcibly in private. But I do wonder whether whoever wrote that article in the Daily Telegraph wasn't perhaps given a steer, and whether that particular article might not have been written less with the Russians, the purported subject of the article, but more the Ukrainians in mind? If so, not before time, I hasten to say, but I want to make it clear again that this is my perhaps over-interpretation of this article rather than what the article itself said. So, little actual news on the battlefronts. As I said, some hints that in Bakhmut city and the areas around, the Russians are continuing to make advances, but very little in terms of actual hard information from there. Going further west, the Russians have now said that the evacuation of the civilian population from Kherson region has now come to an end. And this is quite interesting because from what I can tell, the great majority of people who live in Kherson region and specifically in Kherson city are still there. And the fact that the Russians have now ended this evacuation is perhaps a further sign that they're becoming increasingly confident that they have the situation in Kherson region effectively under control. And here I'm going to say something else, which is that I'm even starting to get the sense that instead of Ukraine looking forward to an advance on Kherson city, which, by the way, continues apparently to be heavily fortified, there are now perhaps the first telltale signs that some people, perhaps in Kiev, perhaps in Western capitals, are becoming worried that the build-up of Russian forces in Kherson region, Russian armored forces in Kherson region, is now on such a scale that it points not to defense, but perhaps to eventual attack. In other words, to the Russians perhaps considering some sort of offensive from Kherson region, either towards Nikolaev in the west or conceivably towards Kryvyi Rog and Nikopol in the north and east. Anyway, we will see. Whilst on the topic of Kherson region, there is one other really very strange article in the Daily Telegraph I must touch on. Well, maybe not the article, but a tweet that was embedded in that article from the British historian Simon Sebag Montefiore. Now, when the Russians evacuated part of the civilian population from Kherson region, or were carrying out the evacuation, they were also removing some monuments, historic monuments, from Kherson city, including the coffin of Prince Potyomkin Tavrichevsky, the lover and probable husband, secret husband of Catherine the Great, who was the Russian general and prince who in the 18th century conquered all of these territories and brought them under the Russian crown, and who established many of these cities in this area, including Kherson and Sevastopol, so I understand, and whose title, Prince Potemkin Tavrichevsky, actually references back to Crimea, which, of course, was often called Taurida in the ancient world, amongst many other names. Anyway, the Russians removed the coffin of Prince Potyomkin from the church where he was buried in Kherson city, and this with the intentions presumably of making sure that his remains either weren't damaged in Ukrainian shelling or didn't fall into Ukrainian hands in the event that the city was indeed recaptured by Ukraine. Anyway, this provoked a fascinating tweet from Simon Sebag Montefiore, Well, he spoke about the Russians stealing Potemkin's bones. Well, that's one view. I would say that if you go to any British museum or this archaeological museum, which is stuffed with Egyptian bodies, mummies as they're called, I mean, I would say that stealing bones is not something that the Russians are the only people who do. But anyway, let's not dwell too much on that. But the most interesting and curious thing for me was that Seaback Montefiore did try to make a contrast between Potemkin, who said would have loathed Putin's crude nationalism. Now, I find that absolutely bizarre, I have to say. I mean, if anybody knows anything at all about the history of Prince Potemkin, certainly he was a very sophisticated, highly educated man, erudite in many languages, but he was also, as far as I know, a passionate Russian patriot, and I can't imagine he would have been anything less than overjoyed that Kherson had been reconquered by the Russian army, which of course he once himself commanded when he fought and won this grueling war in the 18th century against the Ottoman Turks, bringing this vast territory under Russian control. And I have to say, I mean, Seaback Montefiore is, in my opinion, a serious historian. I don't always agree with his interpretations, but I think he was way off beam on this tweet. And I would also say that it's another example, to my mind, of the way in which this particular war is causing even serious historians like Seaback Montefiore to engage in some really strange historical twists and interpretations as they try to justify their support for Ukraine and imply that these regions, which since Potemkin's time, for most of their history, far and away the greater part of their history, were part of first Russia and then the Soviet Union, that these regions legitimately belong to Ukraine. Anyway, that's the situation as of this time on the battlefields. As I said in my program yesterday, I get the distinct sense that it is the Russians now that are gradually wresting the initiative, that are starting to take offensive action in various places. We've seen some signs of that in Kharkiv region. Of course, we have always seen that in Bakhmut region. Perhaps there's also the first telltale indications that that might also be coming in Kherson region before long as well. And by the way, I noticed that the deputy governor of Zaporozhye region, Vladimir Rogov, has now come out and said that if there is a Ukrainian offensive against Zaporozhye region, that could lead to a Russian counterattack, and that could then evolve into very powerful offensive action. And he didn't say that this would result in the capture of the city of Zaporozhye. That surely was the implication. Anyway, that's where we are on the battlefields. Yesterday was also a heavy day of missile and drone attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. And I've seen some reports that the damage done to some of the components of Kiev's energy system were perhaps the most serious to date. I don't pretend to be an expert in these things, so I'm going to wait and see more about, what we can find out about all of that. But anyway, let's get on with Putin's speech. And this is delivered to the Valdai group. This is a meeting that takes place every year, bringing together various intellectuals, heavyweights, foreign policy experts, that sort of thing. It's a place where the Russian leadership meets and discusses the broad range of foreign, economic and such policies. And some people have compared it with Davos and the meeting of the WEF at Davos. They say that it's a kind of Russian equivalent to Davos. Well, perhaps it is. Certainly the Russian great and the good do tend to meet at Valdai. But regardless of that, there is usually, in fact, there is almost always a big speech from Putin at this conference. And we got such a speech this time. And it should be understood, in my opinion, as the last in the sequence of speeches which Putin has been making, which extend all the way back to that speech he made in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, in which he first criticized the unipolar system, the global dominance of the United States, and said that this was something that was dangerous and wrong. And of course, since making that speech in 2007, Putin's language has steadily strengthened. He's now become an outright critic of globalization, of the American hegemonic system, as he describes it, of the collective West and all the rest. And he sometimes used extremely harsh language. I mean, he's referred to the United States and the Western powers on occasions as the empire of lies, for example. And he's made some very, very strong comments of that nature. Well, in this speech and in his subsequent Q&A, which, by the way, was interminably long, as many of Putin's Q&As are, Putin was much more measured. In fact, of this series of speeches, going all the way back to that speech Putin gave way back in 2007 in Munich, this was, for me, far and away the most philosophical. And perhaps because of that, it was also the most temperate. And Putin actually quoted a string of Russian intellectuals, both people on the right, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and people on the, well, you could call them the left, like the philosopher Alexander Zinoviev. First time I think he's ever referenced Zinoviev in a speech, which is interesting. Zinoviev, who passed away some years ago, is becoming an increasingly influential figure in Russian commentary and thinking, as I've noticed. But anyway, it's the first time, to my knowledge, that he referenced Zinoviev. And of course, he did reference Zinoviev. And interestingly enough, Putin also acknowledged that these quotes from some of these philosophers were not quotes that he himself knew or found, that they were actually found for him by his staffers. This is the first time I've seen Putin make that kind of admission in a speech. And again, it perhaps conveys the rather relaxed tone of its contents. Very different, by the way, as I'll discuss in a moment, with the way in which this speech has been talked about in the West. But anyway, very philosophical speech, very moderately worded speech. Now, its essence comes back to something that Putin has been talking about for many, many, many years. Now, in the Q&A, Putin did discuss at some length the current conflict in Ukraine itself. But in the speech, he said very little about it. Most of the speech was devoted to the global problems created by the West's attempts. And I would stress, Putin talks about the West. He justifies that his use of that expression early on in the speech. He accepts that the West is not a monolithic bloc. He says it's to a great extent an artificial concept, but he does say that there's some justification in using that expression, and he does go on and use that expression, even though he makes it very clear as he progresses that, of course, at the core of the West is the United States and the people who lead the United States. Anyway, what Putin says is that the United States, the collective West, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has become, as the Russians would say, dizzy with success. It imagined that it would be in a position to direct and shape the progress of human civilization. It became convinced that it had all the secrets about how human civilization ought to develop, and that it has been trying to impose the neoliberal model on the world. The neoliberal model of democracy. All countries must share the same kind of democratic structures, or what Putin called quasi-democratic structures, as those which the West have. There must be no deviations from this, that they must accept a certain homogeneity in culture and in cultural and lifestyle choices. I have to choose again very careful words here, though I should say for once Putin did the same in the speech itself. And he also spoke about how at the same time as the West, the collective West, as I said, as he puts it, has been trying to impose these structures on everyone else in the world, on every other culture and society and state, it has been acting to obstruct and prevent their independent development. He actually makes a really rather powerful point, which is that the West not only tries to block other forms of independent development by other countries, by other nations, out of a belief in the superiority of its own model and out of pure commercial reasons, but because of a certain brittleness, a lack of confidence, a fear that if other countries are allowed to develop by themselves, developing their own models by themselves, they might actually prove to be more successful than the West, thereby calling into question the West's belief that it represents the only conceivable future. I mean, these were his words. I take these from, this is the translation, the official translation from the Kremlin website. A direct threat to the political, economic, and ideological monopoly of the West lies in the fact that the world can come up with alternative social models that are more effective. I want to emphasize this: more effective today, brighter, more appealing than the ones that currently exist. These models will definitely come about. This is inevitable. By the way, US political scientists and analysts also write about this. Truthfully, their government is not listening to what they say, although it cannot avoid seeing these concepts in political science magazines and mentioned in discussions. So the West has an ideological need to block the development, the free development of other societies using models different from those of the West itself, because it cannot tolerate a successful alternative to itself, because such a successful alternative might undermine the authority of the West's own neoliberal model. Now, it has been said, as Putin has pointed out, before, but to my knowledge, it's the first time that a world leader has actually come out and spoken about it in quite such a straightforward way. And Putin also talked about, again, culture and lifestyle choices. And he said that the important thing is not to try to impose a culture or lifestyle choice, but to respect choices. And very intriguingly, he said that that can include respecting the choices that the West itself makes. So he says this: traditional values are not a rigid set of postulates that everyone must adhere to. The difference with the so-called liberal values is that they are unique in each particular instance because they stem from the traditions of a particular society, its culture and historical background. This is why traditional values cannot be imposed on anyone. In other words, everyone has their own traditional values, which can evolve and change as the society that produces them changes. But it's not for all outsiders to come in, disrespect those traditional values that are there and seek to impose its own ideas. And then Putin goes on to say they must simply be respected, and everything that every nation has been choosing for itself over centuries must be handled with care. This is how we understand traditional values, and the majority of humanity share and accept our approach. This is understandable because the traditional societies of the East, Latin America, Africa, and Eurasia form the basis of world civilization. And then he goes on to say, respect for the ways and customs of peoples and civilizations is in everyone's interests. In fact, this is also in the interest of the West, which is quickly becoming a minority in the international arena as it loses its dominance. Of course, the Western minority's right to its own cultural identity must be ensured and respected, but importantly, on an equal footing with the rights of every other nation. If Western elites believe they can have their people and their societies embrace what I believe are strange and trendy ideas, like dozens of genders or gay pride parades, so be it. Let them do as they please, but they certainly have no right to tell others to follow in their steps. And then Putin goes on to say, as far as Russia is concerned, it does not seek to impose its ideas, its own social norms, its own economic models on other societies and other nations. Russia does not interfere in such matters and has no intention of doing so. Unlike the West, we mind our own business. We are hoping that pragmatism will triumph and Russia's dialogue with the genuine, traditional West, as well as with other co-equal development centers, will become a major contribution to the construction of a multipolar world order. And then he goes on to say, again, at a very considerable length, in various places, that in fact the Russians still hope one day that when the West finally comes to its senses, when it understands that the forces of multipolarity are irresistible, that the unipolar moment that it is clinging on to has indeed passed and cannot be revived, that at some point all the various elements that make up the global system all the various cultures, societies, nations, sovereign nations. He's very clear about the need for nations to remain sovereign, that they will all finally be able to do that which they have been unable to do up to now, which is negotiate and come to sustainable, peaceful understandings with each other through equal dialogue. That might be, at the moment, a rather naive view, but it's what Putin is talking about at the present time. And then he goes on to say that Russia utterly rejects what attitudes, which he says are very prevalent in the West at the present time, and which he doesn't hesitate at times to refer to as neo-colonial, imperialist, and even racist. And he says that I will be direct about certain things. As an independent and distinctive civilization, Russia has never considered and does not consider itself an enemy of the West. Americophobia, Anglophobia, Francophobia, and Germanophobia are the same forms of racism as Russophobia or anti-Semitism, and incidentally xenophobia in all its guises. And he then talks a little bit in contradiction to some of the other things he says about the two Wests, at least two, and maybe more, but two at least. The West of traditional, primarily Christian values, freedom, patriotism, great culture, and now Islamic values as well. A substantial part of the population in many Western countries follows Islam. An interesting idea to reach out to the predominantly immigrant populations, Islamic immigrant populations that are now so prevalent in Western countries, and to conflate them with those of the traditional Old West, if you like. I suspect many people in the West might raise their eyebrows at that, but anyway, that's what Putin said. And then he goes on to say that this traditional West is close to us. We share its common, even ancient roots. But there is also a different West, aggressive, cosmopolitan, and neo-colonial. It is acting as a tool of neoliberal elites. Naturally, Russia will never reconcile itself to the dictates of the West. And he then talks about how the Russians have at various times reached out to the West, how they did, for example, after the jihadi wars in the Caucasus, which were taking place when he became president, and which the West was covertly backing. So he says how despite all of that, the Russians still wanted to develop good, friendly relations with the West, and how, in fact, they found that every attempt that they made to try to establish a modus vivendi with the West was then thrown back into their faces. And he says that this is unacceptable and that Russia is simply upholding its right to exist and to develop freely. We will not become a new hegemon ourselves. Russia is not suggesting replacing a unipolar world with a bipolar, tripolar, or other dominating order, or replacing Western domination with domination from the East, North, or South. This would inevitably lead to another impasse. In other words, what the Russians want is a stable international system in which everybody's views are respected, where nobody seeks to dominate or dictate to anybody else, certainly not on matters of culture or economics or lifestyle issues or such things. And such a world, as he believes, would be a great deal more harmonious and stable than the present one. And he quotes a Russian philosopher, Nikolai Danilevsky, who says that Danilevsky believed that progress did not consist of everyone going in the same direction. This would only result in progress coming to a halt. Progress lies in walking the field that represents humanity's historical activity, walking in all directions. No civilization can take pride in being the height of human development. Well, that's the essence, it seems to me, of what Putin said, the philosophical core of it. Respect, every country must respect each other. There must be no single center. He's scathing, by the way, about the rules-based order. He says, what rules? Nobody even knows what those rules are, and they change from one day to the next, and the West always reinterprets those rules in order to serve its own interests. And that is in the nature of rules that are imposed from one center upon everybody else. And he talks about how that is not a mechanism for stability, that it is a mechanism for chaos. He also then goes into a lot of other details. He talks about, for example, the dollar, the excessive use by the West of its control of the financial system, the world financial system. He enlarged on this considerably, by the way, in his Q&A. But the essence of what he said was this, that the world needs to understand, the West needs to understand, that there is a multiplicity of different civilizational and cultural models, all of which find themselves structured around sovereign states, that the only way to build a sustainable balance is for each to respect the other, not to seek to engage in crusades, or moral crusades or other crusades, trying to change societies, direct or shape the whole structure of the world, impose one single economic, social, or legalistic or quasi-legalistic model, which is identical for everyone. And Putin also said, and he quite interestingly spoke about the need for democracy to be strongest in the sphere of international relations. In other words, each state, each nation should be treated equally, and there should be a genuine partnership and democracy in international relations, with the rights of countries, even Gulf monarchies, for example, being respected alongside those of the democracies or quasi-democracies or pretended democracies, liberal democracies, if you like, of the West itself. Quite an interesting speech, as I said, very philosophically structured, very temperate in tone. Once more, offering, once the present crisis passes, a way forward towards a new balance, even a new dialogue between Russia and the West. As I said, the most temperate of the speeches that he has written. Speaking for myself, I found one of the most interesting passages was one in which he implicitly criticized a book which I personally detest, and that is Karl Popper's famous book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Now, in doing so, I think Putin, well, by the way, he didn't actually mention Popper, and he didn't, in fact, mention the book, though if you read his words, it's quite clear that that is what he's referencing. And I think he went a bit too far in stating its importance. He said that this was a turning point because it meant that classical liberalism the liberalism of, well, Voltaire and people like that, the liberalism that accepts and respects alternative points of view, is replaced by a new model where there is something called the open society, which is threatened by all sorts of enemies who must be cancelled. And again, it's perhaps, as I said, taking that book further than is justified, the influence of that book further than is justified. But of course, it's clearly a jab at those who cite that particular book, Popper's work, as their sort of textbook or philosophical Bible or plan of action, whatever you like to call it. And also, it's another dig, a really clever dig, at the cancel culture, which Putin says is now so widely expressed in the West. Anyway, that was quite interesting. Now, at the end, he did say that the situation is, in fact, becoming quite dangerous at the same time. And the speech ended with these words: "The collapse of the Soviet Union upset the equilibrium of the geopolitical forces. The West felt as a winner and declared a unipolar world arrangement in which only its will, culture and interests had the right to exist. Now this historical period of boundless Western dominance in world affairs is coming to an end. The unipolar world is being relegated into the past. We are at a historical crossroads. We are in for probably the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time most important decade since the end of World War II. The West is unable to rule humanity single-handedly, and the majority of nations no longer want to put up with this. This is the main contradiction of the new era. To cite a classic, this is a revolutionary situation to some extent. The elites cannot and people do not want to live like that any longer. This state of affairs is fraught with global conflicts or a whole chain of conflicts which poses a threat to humanity, including to the West itself. Today's main historical task is to resolve this contradiction in a way that is constructive and positive." That's a very powerful section with which basically he ends his speech. And the classic that he's quoting, the references to a revolutionary situation, I'm not absolutely categorical about this, but I think that he's essentially, actually, quietly referencing a work of Lenin's, that this is a period of enormous turbulence. The new world is appearing. The old globalist, neoliberal, US-dominated Western world is, however, unwilling to give up its hegemonic position, and as a result, there is potential for things going wrong, for a great deal of violence, for, in effect, revolutionary change. I said that it was a quote from, I think he's referencing Lenin, but of course another Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, once said that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, there arises a great diversity of morbid symptoms. Others, by the way, have quoted Gramsci as saying that in the period between the new and the old, there will be an age of monsters. I'm not sure whether it's Gramsci that Putin has in mind. I think it's more likely Lenin. Actually, the expression revolutionary situation, to my mind, points to Lenin. But anyway, in a sense, That's less important than the underlying message that this is a period of tremendous and dangerous change, that given the determination of the Western powers to hold on to their global leadership, there is a very real risk that they will do something dangerous and irresponsible and reckless, and that means that the next decade will be an extremely dangerous one. I don't think, looking at the current international situation, most people would seriously dispute that. Whether the vision for the future that Putin outlines of a great community of nations, each going its own way domestically, developing its economy and its culture, but acting in harmony with all other nations, whether that is a practical one, whether that is a realistic vision of the future, well, that's another question again, and it's not one that I propose to explore in this program. What I will say again is that it's a vision which many, especially in the global south, will be strongly attracted to, and in fact are strongly attracted to. It is why Putin and Russia are winning friends in places like India, China, Africa, the Middle East, even amongst the Gulf monarchies, Latin America, and such places, where American leaders and Western leaders preach, where people like Josep Borrell contrast the beautiful garden that is the European Union, with the terrifying jungle that is supposed to exist elsewhere in the world. That is what Borrell said in a recent speech to European diplomats, to considerable outrage around the world, where people like Borrell talk like that, where American leaders always talk about, America's support for freedom and democracy, about America's determination to uphold its values, which in effect means imposing its values on others. Putin says, let everybody mind their own business. Let everybody develop as they choose, in the way they choose, developing their own societies, their own cultures, their own lifestyle choices as suits them. But let us all cooperate together peacefully for the good of the world and in order to maintain peace. And let's do so with respect for each other, and in a truly equal democratic way. It's not surprising that this is a vision, as I said, that is much more attractive to people in the global south than the Western one, which many people in the global south, and not just the global south, East Asia, must find overbearing, arrogant, and in some respects, as Putin says, near-colonial and oppressive. So one can see, as I said, the power of this message. And I'm going to say something else. I don't have any doubt myself that Putin believes it, that he's sincere, he's personally sincere in what he says. I don't think he always thought this way. I think he has gradually found his way there, but that's the position he's taking now. And notice that he says it's in the interests of the West to actually accept this model. They can't hold on to their hegemony, but if they drop these dangerous ideas which carry with them these terrible risks of a existential crisis, existential for all of humanity, then they are entitled to their culture, their lifestyle choices in the same way as everyone else. So he's actually also reaching out to people in the West. He has a very interesting passage, by the way, in which he resurrects the idea of the Greater Eurasia plan. He says, Eurasia's coming together, China, Central Asia, Russia, Iran, Turkey soon. They're all building up all of these integrated systems. Europe, which is part of the great Eurasian continent in which the majority of humanity lives, Europe could also fully participate and benefit from that. The only reason the Europeans are not doing that is because they cling on to this misplaced belief in their own superiority, which is leading them down a dead end. So quite a powerful, quite an interesting, quite a philosophical speech. Profoundly different from the way it's been reported in the West. I've seen suggestions that it was some kind of a rant. Well, as you can see, it was nothing like that. And notice how the more benign comments that Putin makes, the reaching out to the West, the acceptance of Western lifestyle choices, if that's what Western people want, none of that, of course, is discussed or talked about. A few other things that I did find very interesting, both mentioned by Putin in the speech itself and also mentioned in the Q&A. This speech is the closest that Putin has come to an admission that, in fact, he personally underestimated Russia's resilience in the economic war. He said, very interestingly, that the Russians had trapped themselves into a position not just of economic dependence on the West, but on psychological dependence, so that they'd convinced themselves that if the West pressed a button and did certain things, everything in Russia would fall apart. And now that it hasn't fallen apart, this has been for Russia a liberating moment. It means that they can now, with far greater confidence, move forward, build up their economy, strengthen their society in the way that suits them best. The previous model, in which the Russians were always saying to themselves, if we do this, how will the West respond? If we cut interest rates, we have a massive capital outflow to the West. If we raise interest rates, will Western hot money pour in? All that kind of thing. Now that that's all gone, now that the Russians don't need to worry about those things, they can get about sorting out their economy and their society better. So that was the most interesting passage, or rather passages, in both the speech and the Q&A. Putin himself, in effect, admitting the extent to which Russians in the plural, but implicitly including himself, underestimated Russia's ability to withstand the sanctions and the sense of liberation that their success in withstanding the sanctions has given them. He also made it very clear that, as far as he's concerned, the Russians did not underestimate the difficulties that would be involved in a war in Ukraine. He went into this at considerable length. He talked about how the West had been steadily building up Ukraine's forces over the 8 years since the signing of the Minsk agreement, which he clearly now believes was always intended as a trick, and that Russia has gradually come to accept that peaceful settlement is not going to happen anytime soon, and that Russia needs to agree to prepare for essentially a long war, though he seemed confident about its eventual outcome. And he also had much to say about other things, about China and its successes, about Xi Jinping and his friend, things of that kind. But overall, as I said, a very interesting, very philosophical speech from Putin. I don't think any other leader in the world at this time is capable of making a speech like this. Actually, what people in Russia make of these kind of speeches, I simply don't know. I suspect it passes well over the heads of most people. But in terms of the audience, this very intellectual, erudite, multinational audience that he's talking to in Valdai, well, there, of course, is probably taken very seriously indeed. But anyway, whatever, a very interesting, very measured speech, very different, as I said, from the way in which it's been reported in the West, where it's passed off as some sort of hysterical anti-Western rant. One very last thing about it, Putin once again made clear that the Russians have no plan to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. In fact, he spoke about the way in which the Western powers appear to have nuclear weapons on their brain, and said some very uncomplimentary things about the British Prime Minister who's just ceased to be Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who made certain very reckless comments, or at least Putin says they were very reckless at a time when she was Foreign Secretary. But for me, this has never been an issue. I've never at any time felt that the Russians were suggesting or broaching the possibility that Russia might use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. In fact, Putin pointedly reminded everybody that the only country which has used nuclear weapons, and done so moreover against a power, Japan, that had no nuclear weapons and was at that time on the brink of military defeat, was the United States. And he said, look at our military doctrine and you will understand that the kind of things people are talking about in terms of us using nuclear weapons in Ukraine is impossible. So, an interesting speech altogether, shows Putin at his most reflective. In practical terms, it's a speech designed both to justify Russia's conduct and Russia's actions to the Russian people, but also, unquestionably, to appeal to the global South, which it is now successfully doing. Well, that's my discussion of Putin's speech. More from me soon, and it only remains for me to wish you all a very good day. Please remember that you can find us on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course Rockfin. So you can find us on all of those other platforms. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.